Well, hello, everybody. Here we are with the BizTalk live session for February. I have Daniel and Andrew here, and today we're going to be covering working with orchestrations when you're doing a migration. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Daniel to tell us all about it.
So
awesome. Thanks, Valerie. You go, Andrew.
Yeah, so welcome everyone. So Dan, do you want to get the presentation up and I'll talk through the first part of it and we go from there. So hi everyone. So we are going to talk about converting orchestrations with the BizTalk Migrator. So I'm assuming you were here last time. If not, you can catch up on the last episode, January's episode on YouTube. But what we covered last time was really we were talking about deployment. So if you haven't deployed to Logic Apps before from the command line, there are a lot of prerequisites that actually are needed to make that work, and we covered those last time. And then we looked at some of the other deployment issues that people commonly come across, so that when you've converted that using the BizTalk Migrator, you can fix those. So if you didn't see that one last time, definitely check it out. So this time, what we are going to talk about is we're going to talk about orchestrations, and particularly, BizTalk orchestrations. For those of you who are BizTalk devs, the features of orchestrations, you almost take them for granted. But actually, if you have to break that down into component pieces and put those back together, reassemble those back together in a different technology, it's really a difficult technical challenge. And so, certainly with the BizTalk Migrator, it's a work in progress, shall we say, that there's some parts are supported by the tool, other parts hopefully come in the near future. But we're going to go through the features of orchestration that are supported and then talk a little bit about how that is. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at some real life orchestrations and then look at how they look when converted to Logic Apps and compare and contrast. So if we want to move on, Dan, so again, as you'll all know, I've got the link at the top for this diagram. In the Azure section of GitHub, there's the AIM tool, which is the sort of the first repository you go to, the first port of call for the BizTalk Migrator, and that's where all the documentation is. And so you can see the link in the top of the screen. That's where you go to get this diagram. And this diagram shows how orchestrations are an orchestration gets pieced together as a Logic app. And if we can go to the next slide, Dan, that just zooms in a little bit. So obviously, instead of a message box, what we use is a service bus topic for publish and subscribe. So an orchestration needs to have effectively a subscription to a service bus topic. So the message receiver, so the equivalent to a receive shape, obviously is actually a service bus trigger, and that's subscribing to a topic on service bus. And then we need to initialize. So again, if you look at what goes on behind the scenes in orchestration, when the orchestration first starts, it goes through effectively a constructor where variables are initialized and you kick off the process. So again, with a Logic app, there is an initialization section where we do that. And this is all done via snippets. So a Logic app, when you deploy when you develop and deploy a Logic app, it's an ARM template. Which is a big JSON file that you can then fire at Azure, and it goes through the Azure Resource Manager and deploys the Logic app. Now, because that's a JSON file, we can just build this up by stacking different snippets of JSON on top of each other. So if you look at this diagram in detail, you can see that you've got the things like the message receiver is actually a snippet that can be put in to the ARM template, and then the initializing the variables is actually a series of snippets, a little snippet for each variable, and then we get the step configuration, which is the actions that are going to be that are going to do things like retrieve configuration, get the next, what is the next step, because what we're doing in Logic app is chaining a whole sequence of steps together. And then of course, as we go into the orchestration, there are all the workflow activities that we know. And some of those involve sending messages. Some of those might be maps and transforms, and some of those might be further receives as things have come out from another service. So if we move on, then what to the next slide, what we've got here is we've got a list of all the orchestration features, and in this slide, what I've done is I've broken this down into effectively three categories. So there's how the orchestration communicates with the things outside of it. So obviously you've got send ports and receive ports are the way that you get messages in and out of an orchestration. Correlation sets are obviously how you recognize a message that you're looking for that's rooted to that orchestration by looking for context properties. And then you've got variables and parameters and role links. There are also the types. I should probably have done the types first, but there's port types, correlation types, multi-part message types, and role link types. And then we've got all the shapes. And as you can see, there are 17 different BizTalk shapes that the common ones that we use all the time, send, receive, construct, message, transform. But that is the extent of BizTalk components. So we've got a palette here of shapes that we drag onto an orchestration, and we can build amazingly complex applications from this quite limited palette of different options. It's amazing what you can build from just the things that are on this slide. Now, if we move on to the next slide, we then get the things that are supported by Logic Apps. So the ones that are still in the dark green or the solid green are the ones that are still supported once we have converted that orchestration into the Process Manager Logic App. So we can send and receive, we can do variables. At the moment, we don't support orchestration parameters. And at the moment, we don't support correlation sets. And so the only thing we've got that's able to communicate is ports, really. So we effectively support a port type, because a port type will ultimately be the thing that either sends to the service bus topic or subscribes to a service bus topic. And then in shapes, if we just go through these one at a time. So call orchestration, when that actually maps onto Logic Apps, it's just a call Logic App, which is actually quite a simple thing to do. In terms of rules, obviously, Business Rules Engine isn't supported in Azure integration services, so we can't do that. We don't support compensation yet, but you can construct a message. And obviously, when you construct a message, you can do two things. You can either assign a message or you can transform. And so, because constructing messages is such a core core piece of functionality, then that needs to be supported. The migration tool also supports decision shapes, so you can do your different branching, but delays aren't supported, and some of these things are the things that are more difficult to do when you've got something in the cloud, because obviously in BizTalk a delay may involve an orchestration dehydrating for a period of time and sitting in the message box. When you're actually spinning up cloud resources, those things are a lot harder to actually carry across into the cloud paradigm. Now, expression shapes are interesting because, as you know, in BizTalk, in orchestration expression shapes, those are Xlang S. In Logic Apps, the equivalent to expression shapes are JavaScript. And Dan will talk a little bit about this later, but what the migration tool does is it actually takes your code, puts comments around it, and then puts it in a Logic Apps expression shape. So you can then evaluate your own expression shape and see whether it's going to see what you need to do to rewrite it to make it work in your Logic App. Group shapes, no, groups don't actually do much, but they're a very good thing for organizing the children of shapes. Now, listen shape again it's a bit like a parallel action plus and you often use a listen with a delay, so again that doesn't translate quite very well into Logic Apps. And at the moment, loops aren't supported. Parallel actions aren't supported. We've said send and receive, and obviously scopes, particularly with transactional scopes, those aren't supported because again you can't, although you can have try catch type of error handling in logic apps, it is different. Again, Dan might talk a little bit about this as well, but certainly things like atomic transactions just don't carry across to a cloud world where effectively you're linking things together via HTTP REST calls rather than MSDTC transactions. And so the last few that we haven't talked about are, well, start orchestration is effectively starting another logic app. Instead of calling it in line, you can start another logic app. But we don't support so far suspend, terminate, and throw in exceptions. So these are these. So if we look at this, if we move on to the next slide, please, Dan. I just want to remind everyone how the conversion works, because obviously what we do is we're taking an MSI, we're unpacking that MSI to get the binding file and the assemblies that are that constitute BizTalk, and that's what we call the discover phase. The next phase is the parse phase, where we take all those raw pieces of a BizTalk application and we build a model in memory of that BizTalk application, and then what we do is we go to the analyze phase, and that's where we produce what's called the target model. Now, the target model is the representation of your BizTalk application in Azure. Now, what we know, the report is actually rendering that model into a report that you can read, but the convert stage is when we actually combine that model with scripts and templates to produce your actual output. And so everything that you get in that previous slide, the things that are supported are really because we've built them in the target model by creating analysis rules, and we've created templates for them that the converts can run on. So as the tool, so hopefully everyone that's on this is very interested in contributing to the open source project, because you can always add more rules into the analysis phase, and you can add more templates into the convert phase to get some of those extra features of orchestrations that aren't there at the moment. But I just want to remind you that that's the way that the tool works, and that those features in the orchestration, when we talk about the snippets, those are all the little templates that are in the AIM Azure repo that are building up those logic apps. So I think it's time now to go and look at a demonstration of how some of this works in action. This has all been a bit theoretical so far, but if we move on to the next slide, then. So what I'm going to hand over to Dan now, who's going to demo. Firstly, is going to demo a simple orchestration. So do you want to take it away, Dan?
Yeah. Cheers. Thanks, Andrew. Just check you guys can hear me. Yep. Awesome. Alrighty. Thanks for that. So orchestration conversion, and I'm hoping this came across through Andrew's brilliant description of it, is very complex. But in this case here, we're going to look at a simple orchestration, and we're going to start with one of the examples that's actually in the repo. So this is what's called scenario 4. And this scenario was designed to receive an XML message via an HTTP adapter, and it uses a custom pipeline with the JSON decoder. So it takes in a JSON message, converts it to XML, and then that appears in the orchestration. The orchestration is very simple. It has a receive shape, then it has a construct message shape, a transform shape, which creates a response, and then it sends that response out. And then that response goes back out via a custom send pipeline with a JSON encoder, converts it back to JSON, and out it goes. That's what the scenario is. And if I take you up and show you where that scenario actually is, so if I bring you up into here, hopefully you're familiar from some of the previous sessions. We've talked about the repos and what's up in GitHub, but the main repo is the AIM tool repo. But the actual scenarios, because they're part of the BizTalk solution, are over in the AIM BizTalk repo. And inside here, there is a scenarios folder. And in here, we have the 4 scenarios. And each of these is a BizTalk solution and an MSI. So if I look at this one here, the HTTP JSON org, in here we can see that there's a solution, and in the MSI folder is the actual MSI itself. So you can just download the MSI if you want it. Or if you fork this repo, or sorry, if you clone the repo locally or fork it and clone it, then you'll have the actual code on your machine, or you can just download all the repo onto your machine to get it, whichever way you want to do it. But this particular solution, if I quickly show you that is over here. So you can see we have a standard BizTalk solution here with a number of schemas in it and a single orchestration, and we've got a map. And this is the orchestration as described. So it's got a request response port, which has a activating receive shape. Then it's got a construct shape, a transform shape that executes a map, and a send shape. That's it. Very, very simple. How simple could an orchestration be? It's not very realistic because you wouldn't do this in an orchestration, but it's designed to show what happens when you convert it. If we come over to the properties, we'll see that we've got one port and we've got two messages, and that's it. I think we've got some types in here, so you've got a port type. There's no multi-part message types or anything. It's one port type here. Okay, so it's very, very simple. Now, I'm not going to run the tool on this and then run through uploading it. I'm going to show you what it looks like. But when we come to the second example, which is a much more realistic orchestration, I am going to run the tool over it and show you what you get. So this particular orchestration here ends up looking like this when we come across to the logic apps. I think it is this one. Yes, here we go. So the naming convention for your logic app might look a bit funny. But what you've got is logic. So this follows the cloud adoption framework that Microsoft put forward for the naming convention. So we indicate what the object is. Then AIM Process Manager. All your orchestrations will end up with AIM Process Manager at the beginning because that's what they're converted to, a process manager. That's the pattern, the enterprise pattern that's being used. Then we have AIM. Then we have the, in here, this is actually the name of the BizTalk application. So this was called aim.http-json-awk, and that gets converted to aim-http-json-awk. And then you have the name of your orchestration, then you've got the environment, and then you've got your unique identifier you supply when you ran the tool. I won't cover that part now, but that's just to make this unique for your run. One thing to bear in mind is if your orchestration name is long, this is quite a lot here. And as I discovered earlier on today, there's a limit to workflow names of 80 characters. So if you hit over 80 characters, when you come to deploy this, it won't work. And you have two choices there. You can either shorten your orchestration name, which might be difficult if you've got it already deployed, or you can edit the files to shorten the name directly. But that's a hard limit. Anyway, if we come down to here, if you remember in the orchestration, we have two messages that are defined, so purchase order request message and purchase order response message. You'll notice that the converted shapes here, or converted actions, have a number in them as well. And that is to do with making things unique, but also to track things. It's the way things are grouped, but they're ordered. It allows us to use snippets and then order them as well. So this here is effectively the message definition. If I scroll up a little bit, we've got a number of things going on here. This is kind of the boilerplate that Andrew alluded to earlier. So an orchestration is kicked off via a subscription to a service bus topic. And this replicates what was happening with the message box earlier. Then we've got a number of system variables that are used by the underlying processing for the process manager. And then we start going into any variables and messages that were defined in the orchestration. So if you remember in the orchestration, if I quickly switch back to that, we only had two messages. Oh, that's the wrong one. That's my more complex one. We don't want to see that yet. This one here, purchase order request message and purchase order response message. That's it. And that nicely maps to what we see here. We have two variable declarations to hold those messages. Okay. Then we have a scope action, which holds everything, all the orchestration stuff. And then under here is the exception handling that is provided, that is boilerplate. So was there an error during processing? And if there was, we go to the suspend queue. If there wasn't, then we complete. If we go into the workflow here and go in, you'll see there's another bit of boilerplate here, which is get the received message from service bus, get the configuration, and then we go into what the actual orchestration does. So in here, we've got construct purchase order response. And again, if I come back over to the orchestration, construct purchase order response is the name of this construct shape. And then inside there, we've then got a transform. So back to the code here, this is what's happening. So we've created a scope with the same name as the construct shape. And inside there, we're creating another scope with the same name as the transform shape or the message assignment shape. So we're using scopes to represent the shapes for certain shapes. Where we need a shape to contain something else, we put that inside a scope. Because in BizTalk, the construct shape is doing work in the background. It's saying, well, I'm creating this type of message. We don't have an equivalent in a logic app, but we still want to represent that shape. So we put it inside a scope. If there was a group in logic apps, if you could have a group action that didn't actually do anything, we'd be using that. The tool would be using that, but it's not. So inside the construct here, we've got a whole lot of actions that do the transform. So we've got to get the body content out of the service bus message. We've got to call a transform. Then we've got to initialize some variables. So in BizTalk, this is all handled in one shape for you, but obviously BizTalk's doing a whole lot of work under the covers at the time, and we have to represent that in a number of different shapes here. So this is running the transform, and then we're done. And then the send purchase order response. So this here is the send shape that's at the bottom of the orchestration. And what it's going to do, it's going to set some header properties and set some routing properties, and then it's going to publish that message. So what's happened here is the tool has converted the send shape. It's looked at the port type properties and worked out what properties need to be set on that to route it. So if you think about in BizTalk, when I send a message through a port, it's going to promote certain properties for me. For example, it's going to promote the message type. That's what this is doing here. Yeah, it's working out the message type of the message and promoting it. And then it's going to publish it back to the message box. And there we go, we're done. So that is effectively doing exactly what the orchestration does. And more importantly, this works. So if I run something through this, it will work, it will transform it and drop it out the other end. So it's a really good way of seeing what you can do. Now, admittedly, if you were writing a logic app from scratch, you probably wouldn't do everything exactly like this. You wouldn't create a scope that's empty and then put another scope inside it. You might just go, well, hold on, I don't need this all going on here. But that's an optimization, I guess, because you might add other shapes in here as well, other actions in here. So that's a very basic logic app. What I want to do now is show you what happens when we move to a slightly more complex logic app. So in this case here, a custom spell check is good. It's a custom orchestration, attempting to show what a realistic BizTalk orchestration contains. So what are we doing here? So we're receiving an XML message, but now we're having a filter. So we've set a filter property on the receive shape. So I want to see what that does. I want to use a scope shape with an exception handler. Now, earlier on, Andrew pointed out that scope shapes are not supported, which is true. So what's going to happen? I want to use a fault. So on my port type, I've added in a fault operation. What does that do? And then I've added some expression shapes in with code. So initializing variables, doing some logging, that sort of thing. And the actual orchestration is going to construct a request and send it off to another service, get back a response, and then use a decide shape to look at that response and decide what we're going to do. Alrighty, so what does that look like in BizTalk? So in BizTalk, this is the orchestration. So I say it's realistic. It's more realistic, but if it's anything like the BizTalk orchestrations I've worked on, this is very simple. But here we have a request response port with a fault operation on it. We've got a receive shape, which has got a filter expression on it. We have a scope here with an exception handler, and we're catching system exceptions, and we're just setting a variable at the moment. And then we have an init shape up here, initialize shape, and in there we've got some code happening here. We're assigning the body of the message to an XML document, and then we're setting a tracking ID, and we're getting the process ID of the orchestration, and we're setting a log message prefix for doing logging. Yeah, so this is all pretty standard stuff. Then we're constructing a new request, and we're sending that out a request response send port, a two-way send port. We're receiving a response. We're pulling out a value using a promoted property to do that. And then we're doing some logging. So, I mean, it obviously just says logging in here. It's not real logging, but it's just showing a bit of code there. Sorry, Valerie, there we go. It's just writing out to the console. And then down here, anyone that's used a fault operation will be familiar with this pattern where you've tried to put constructing the fault inside your exception handler, and then the orchestration won't compile. So you bring it out, and we go, do we have a fault, yes or no? If we do have a fault, then we're going to construct a fault message and send the fault. If we don't have a fault, then we've got a decision here that looks at the response that we got back, and is it valid? Then it's creating a particular response. Again, this is a message assignment shape. It's not really doing anything. Yeah, it's just designed to show what gets copied across in logic apps. And then again, we're doing something similar here, and then we're sending the response. Okay, and then at the bottom we're logging. So we're saying, right, I just want to log that the orchestration has completed. So for some reason I can't double click that. There we go, writing out to the console. So again, this isn't. It's more realistic. It's more complex. And let's see what happens when we try. Oh, and what else have we got? Sorry, before I move on. So we've got 2 ports. We've got 5 messages, because we've got the request and response that we've received. We've got the fault, and then we've got the 2 that we're sending off. Then we've got some variables defined in here. So a Boolean and some string variables, and I've got an awk name variable here. There's obviously the exception scope. And then under types, I'm using multi-part message types, which aren't supported. What's going to happen with those? And then I've got the port types defined up in here. So that's it. I haven't defined any correlation types or anything like that, because I know they're not supported. As Andrew said earlier, though, what's interesting, though, is what the tool does is it actually parses all these things and builds them into the model, the source model. It's just that there's no equivalent in the target model. There's nothing to convert them to, but that could be done. You know, an example is suspend and terminate in an orchestration. So we have suspend and terminate in an orchestration. In logic apps, we have a suspend action, which can be used to send back, you know, a success response because I've suspended, or a terminate response. That's how you terminate your logic app early. And you could therefore take the terminate shape in an orchestration and relatively easily migrate that across. Except that most people I know use terminate in an exception handler, and they're not supported. But again, exception handlers in a scope, you could do that. That could be done off a scope. You could have a main scope, and then you just have some activity that happens if it fails. The only problem is there's no concept of .NET exception handling in a logic app. So how's that going to work? You know, if I'm catching a SOAP exception, what am I going to do with that? There's a bit of work that would need to be done to work that out. Alrighty, so that's that. Back in the orchestration here, sorry, in the project, you can see I've got a number of schemas. I've got a map. So I've got an employee request, an employee response schema, and a fault schema. They're all used inside this orchestration. Alrighty, so the first steps that we would follow here would be, well, what are we going to do next? How do we get this into the tool to run it? And what I would be doing is I would be deploying the orchestration. So, I mean, normally I'd be using something like the BizTalk deployment framework, but I'm going to cheat. And I'm actually going to do deployments here directly to BizTalk, and it has now succeeded. And then I can come over to the admin console here and do a refresh. And my application is here. And I can see the orchestration here, the one. I can't make this bigger, unfortunately. Or I haven't made it bigger. Here's my complex orchestration. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to export it. So I will export that to an MSI file, because this is what the application takes in. I'm going to turn off exporting the web directory at the moment, simply because I didn't set that up. In this example, I set up the HTTP adapter, but I haven't created an IIS application to go along with it, a virtual directory. So that will fail if I try and do that. So I'll move on, and I'm going to stick this in C temp sample MSIs, and then I'm going to call 1-02-25, which is today's dates. It will overwrite an existing file, and off it goes, and it's done. Cool. We've exported it. So now what do? We need to come over and actually run the tool. I'm not going to go through how to run the tool because hopefully you've watched previous webcasts. But up here I have aim, migrate, then the location of that MSI. And I apologize if the colors aren't clear on my super duper background. Then I'm using the UK South region and I'm using BTS as my unique deployment ID. I will run the tool. And with luck, it will just run successfully and I'll get no red. It's done. There we go. It ran. And further up here, I can find the name of the folder that it used. Here it goes. AIM 8908 is what I'm looking for. So I come over to my file system here and I go to my sample MSIs and there it is, 8908. Here it is here. So I've got a report as normal. And in that report, I can have a look and I can see my input BizTalk applications and my output, and I can come to my output and I can see that I'm getting a whole lot of things here. But somewhere down near the bottom is going to be a process manager section. Here we go. Here's my complex orc, and it's saying that it's 3 stars. That's not bad. I'd accept that in Amazon. That's telling me that it can do some of what's in the orchestration, not everything, but some. So I'll get a reasonable amount set across. Alrighty. Also in here is the scripts you know and love, the deploy all and the tear down all and everything else. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I already have a BizTalk application deployed, so with the same unique deployment IDs. I've already got API management and everything else. I just wanted to deploy that logic app. That's all I really wanted to deploy. I don't want to deploy all the rest of the gubbins to go with it, just for testing this. So I'll show you what happens when we deploy this. And more importantly, I'm going to show you it failing. Because one of the things that happened when I built that orchestration, I ran it through the tool and I tested it before this session today, is I discovered a bug in the tool. And I also discovered some limitations as well to do with naming lengths. And I'll show you those. So I happen to know that under applications, I go to orchestration test. And there are a couple of things we're going to want to do in here. So I need the resource group that my logic app is going to be in, and that is in this group here. And I need the actual process manager, which is in intermediaries. And if I make that bigger, here's complex org. This is the orchestration I want. And in here, there's a lot of files in here. There's 2 things that are being deployed. There's an API connection and there's a logic app. And those are the 2 things I need to deploy. Yeah. So the resource group, to deploy that, what we can do is we can come back out here and we can go to applications and the group here. And I want to deploy this. So I'm going to copy that and I'm going to come here and I'm going to change directory to that path. And in here, I want to run the application group PS1 file here, okay, the PowerShell script. So I can do that with / and then the name of that, and then off it goes. And it will deploy just the resource group, because that's the first thing I want. I want that resource group. Dum-de-dum-de-dum. And you'd think deploying a resource group should be pretty quick, given there's nothing in it. Right, whilst that's running, I am going to switch the other window here to the intermediaries folder, and then the complex org folder, and I'm going to deploy both the API connection and the logic app. Oh, look, that deployment. The resource group's now deployed. Cool. All right, so move to this one here, and what I will do is I will deploy the API connection first. So again, there's a PowerShell script here. If you look in the PowerShell script, all it's doing is it's running Azure CLI, and it's calling, well, what it's actually doing is it's calling this new process manager API connection, new process manager service plus API connection PowerShell script with some parameters. And this one here is running the Azure CLI to deploy an ARM template passing in some of these values down here, some of the templates that are down here. So this is the one I want to run, this one at the top here. So deploy 100. They're numbered so that they're automatically in order. And I can run that, and that will deploy to, oh, all right, dot backslash, then that. All right, let's try that again. There we go. So that will deploy the API connection. And we'll wait for that. One of the things I didn't go here, which we talked about on a previous session, was we're running inside the Azure CLI at the moment, which means, well, what subscription am I deploying to? How do I know what I'm deploying to? And I can do that by using the Azure CLI here. And I can go AZ account show. That will show me what subscription I'm currently deploying to. So I'm deploying to my BTS Migrator subscription. So I'm, one of the things we'll talk about, or we did talk about, is the idea of updating the deployment script so that it helps you select a subscription if you're not familiar with using the Azure CLI. Yeah. So this is now finished deploying the API connection. Cool. And now I can deploy the Logic app. So I can attempt to deploy the Logic app, but I will tell you from past experience that it will fail. The screen, dot backslash. Oh, I didn't copy that. Let's try that again. There we go. And it's going to run. And this will fail. And it will fail for a very good reason, and that is there is a bug in the tool at the moment, which in certain scenarios, I only found this bug today, when it creates the scope shape and it puts the actions inside. Do you remember we had a scope that had for the construct shape, and then we had a scope for the message assignment shape or message transform shape? Inside there, it's not hooking up the run afters. So the run afters are how you link together all the actions. See, here we go, it fails. Now that's quite hard to read with the my lovely background. I should turn my background off. But what it's saying here is that there's a missing run after. And in fact, if I select this name of this action here, try that again, actually, hold on. And then I go to, oh, what am I doing? I'm making all sorts of mistakes here. If I actually open up this Logic app, or the actual template here for the Logic app, I open that up in Notepad, and I search for that action. So hopefully everyone on this call is, really familiar with editing Logic apps in JSON. And if you're using the new runtime preview, you must be. But what we can see here is that we're inside a scope shape here, yeah? And actually in the scope shape are only a couple of actions. In fact, if I collapse them, you can see there's not much in the scope shape. There's actually only 2 actions. But this action here, neither of them have a run after. And when you do that, the designer or the runtime for Logic apps doesn't know what order to run these in. But more importantly, I am referring, this expression here is referencing the outputs of this Logic app here. And in order to do that, you actually have to have the run after. It's illegal. Well, illegal is the wrong word, but it's frowned upon. It's not allowed. So the solution is to come into here and add a new run after here. Tell I do a lot of editing and Notepad of Logic apps, and I want to run when that's succeeded. Cool. All right. So that's one of them. And if I run it again now, it'll get a bit further until it gets to the next scope. And then you'll find the next scope has the same problem, and then the scope after that, and the scope after that, and the scope after that. So there's quite a few here that have this issue. Okay. So that's the first problem I found when I did this. All right. So let's assume I've done that. And here's one I created earlier where I've actually gone through and done it. The next issue I hit, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to recreate the issue by rerunning something. I'm going to recreate the issue I hit, and that requires me to find a composed shape. Bear with me. I wasn't planning to do this as part of the demo, but then I thought, you know what? Let's do it. Let's go all the way to the bottom and search backwards, and I'm looking for a composed shape of type. Here we go, this one here. So this was a JavaScript code, and I discovered a limit that I knew about but had forgotten about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to search back to a slightly older run. If I come back to sample MSIs here, this one here I ran earlier today, and this has got the logic app I actually fixed in there, and the one you saw me editing. Okay, it's the same MSI. And if I go to applications, orchestration test, intermediaries, and then complex orc is the orchestration I want. And this is the one I edited earlier. So now I can get, I'm going to switch to this folder on my Windows terminal here. So we'll cd to, no, help if I put a space in, cd to that, I'll clear screen. And I can run the same command again. And this time I shouldn't get an error to do with the run afters, but I'll get a different error. And this error threw me when I first saw it. And I was like, oh, okay, I'd forgotten about that. And that has to do with the fact that there is a limit to the number of JavaScript actions you can have in a logic app. And that limit is 10. And guess how many I've got in my converted orchestration? 11. And that has to do with the number of expression shapes, because as part of the conversion process, it's taking your BizTalk expression shapes and it's outputting those. Here we go. So it's quite hard to read here, but it's saying that the maximum allowed is 10. You've got 11 actions of type JavaScript code and you're only allowed 10. And again, the solution to that is to change the file, and wherever we've got one of these and it says JavaScript code, I'm going to change it to compose, but only for, number 11 and beyond. Luckily, I only have 11. If I had 21, I'd have to go and find, a whole lot of these and do them. So that's something that has been raised with the product group to find out what can we do around that. Okay, but that's the next issue I hit. There was one other issue I hit earlier on when I had originally called my orchestration complex orchestration as the whole name. And then I hit the 80 character limit for workflow names and variable names or action names. They're set to 80 characters. So I had to shorten the name of my orchestration. So this again is something that I think, I'm going to take as feedback to the product group about the tooling to say, well, would it be possible to shorten the name of the logic apps that are generated? Because the logic app name is quite long. I'll show you. And can we shorten that so that we don't hit the 80 character limit if you've got a long orchestration name, already in your in BizTalk. So I'm going to run this again, come back out to Windows Terminal, and this time, unless the demo gods are frowning upon me, this will work. Come on. You want to work. Come on. Okay. Well, it's looking good. It hasn't got to an error so far like it did last time. And
yeah, taking a while is a good sign, isn't it?
It is a good sign. No. Normally not in other places, but here we go. Look at that. Woo! No red. It worked. Excellent. So now what I do is I come back out, and here's the resource group that was created earlier. And if I refresh in here, I should find we've got an API connection and a logic app. Look at that. There we go. Brilliant. So anyone who's done deployment of ARM templates is going, well, what are you excited about? I don't understand. You've just run an ARM template. But no, this was auto-generated. That naming convention here, you can see the issue. This is a long name, given that the only part that's got the orchestration name in it is this bit here. The rest of it is added in to make it unique within the resource group. So some of these things could be shortened down. And to tell the truth, you can do that yourself. If you're hitting the 80 character limit, I went and renamed my orchestration, but you could just go into the deployment files and change it. I could come in here, and I know that my orchestration name is defined in a parameters file here, and I edit that. Here it is here. I can just change that. However, you've got to change it in a few other places as well, because what happens here is that, especially if you're working with some of the intermediaries, is there's what we call a root that is stored in config. And what happens is in the config, if we want to call an orchestration, that orchestration name is in the config. However, there's an exception for orchestrations, because orchestrations are never called by anything else unless you're using the call orchestration or start orchestration shape. So if your orchestration is receiving and therefore is going to have a subscription, then you can shorten the name here and it won't affect anything else other than the configuration. There's another thing you'd have to shorten, which is you'd have to come back out and find the configuration for this item, and that's not in here, that's further up. That would be under here under config, and we'd look for configuration entries, and we'd look for the configuration entry for that orchestration in here, and inside here we would just want to double check here that there's nothing else that needs to be changed as well. So we would go and edit this, and here's the name of the orchestration here, and so we'd want to change this as well. So if I change the, it's looking for this keyed value is actually hard coded in the orchestration. So if you're changing the name of the orchestration, just double check whether or not you need to change this as well. Okay. One of the easiest ways to do it is to run Notepad and use a Notepad++ and goes find in files and and what you can do is then search up a global search and replace across your entire conversion folder. So everywhere that it had that name, just change it all. That's the safest way to do it. Alrighty, so we've now deployed our orchestration. We come back in here and let's go and see what we've got. As a refresher, if we go back to Visual Studio, this is what we had. Alrighty, so we've got receive shape, an exception scope. We're initializing with an expression shape. We're doing some construction and sending a message, and then we've got some stuff going on down here with the decide shape. And we've also got some variables. So we have quite a few variables here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 variables defined and 5 messages. So what do we get in our orchestration, in our logic app? We get lots of stuff. So remember we talked about earlier that there's certain boilerplate that every process manager gets. So it's going to get a trigger which subscribes to the service bus topic. And this is interesting because remember there was a filter. So I'll show you that in a minute. There's actually a filter attached to this on the subscription. In AIS, the way you're going to subscribe and use filters is via a subscription, which is part of Service Bus, not part of your Logic app. So we're connecting to that subscription. These variables here are the boilerplate ones all the way down here. And then we start getting to the ones that were defined in the orchestration. These should look familiar. Message body XML, XML document. Now that's an interesting one. They're defined as system.xml.xml document, but they've had to be brought across as an object because XML document's not supported in a Logic app. XML is, you can store XML in an object. Okay. And then orc names come across, and look, it's come across and it's got the same value as we had in the orchestration. So it's brought that across as well. Then after the variables, it's brought across all the messages. So we had 5 messages defined here. So, you know, the request and the response and the fault, again, they'll just be defined as objects. There's nothing in them. And then we've got the workflow and then the standard boilerplate exception handling at the bottom. And in the workflow, we're going to have the boilerplate to get the message from Service Bus and then get configuration. And then here's our exception scope. So it means that it has parsed the scope. It recognizes a scope object, a scope shape, but it doesn't recognize the exception handling, and it doesn't do anything if you set like your scope to atomic or something or long running. It doesn't recognize that. But at least it's created a Logic app scope to match the BizTalk scope shape. All right, so inside here, we've got a code expression. So again, this is the JavaScript code expression. And what it's done in here is it's brought in the C# code and commented it out for you, and then just put some boilerplate JavaScript in there. Now, what's interesting about that is sometimes your C# will just execute. If it's close enough to JavaScript and it's working with objects that are available either in JavaScript or within the Logic app, you could use what's here with very little, without changing much of it. However, in our case here, this is trickier to do. I'm updating the values of various variables. So ideally, what would be happening here is I would be doing that. I'd have to manually go and update my variable initialization up here. Or to do this, I'm going to be running a logic apps expression. So I would want a set variable shape that sets just this variable at this point. Yeah. So again, there's work to do here. I'd have to split this out myself. But at least I've got the code here to look at. Yeah. And then there's an activity group here, which is constructing a message. Again, what I'm doing here is I was doing that via XML. I'd have to replace this with something else. So most likely I put a compose shape in here to do something. Yeah. Or maybe I'd call a function app or something. And then sending to a web. Now this is interesting because this isn't technically supported, but it does something. It publishes it to the message box. So it's publishing that message. Hour 25, it says. I have no idea when that was. Okay.
Okay, we seem to be back on now, but the screen isn't refreshing correctly over on the YouTube.
No, I can see that. I can see that. Okay.
And we're spinning again.
Okay, it's having a problem transcoding. Hey, Derek. Yeah, of course I can. Okay, I've stopped sharing and wait for it to catch up. There we go.
There you go.
And then I'll share again. And we'll wait for it to catch up. And
looks much better.
Yeah, so that looks okay.
Okay, that looked horrible. I'm regretting having gone with really funky backgrounds for my Windows terminal. I won't show that again. Righty. I don't know how much of this we've lost, but if we have lost anything, we'll get it back. But I was just saying that the send to web does something funny. And at the bottom here, the decision shape, that's what I wanted to talk about, is how a decision shape comes across. So for example, our log expression here, that's an expression shape that comes through with the code in here. So that, for example, might work, But a decision shape is interesting because in BizTalk, I'm reluctant to switch windows actually in case something goes funny, but the BizTalk decision shape is an odd one because it's kind of a cross between an if-else and a switch statement. There's nothing else quite like it because you can put the conditions on each branch. So that's what makes it like a switch statement, is that I can come across here and I can have, this case or this case or this case or otherwise, yeah. But you can put a separate condition on each branch, which makes it more like an if statement. There's a conditional there. Now, the logic apps switch statement, logic apps has, an if, but it also has a switch statement. So in order to replicate this, what the tool has had to do is separate into two actions. One is run the switch expression.
Just on the last couple of points, aren't we then?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The question is whether or not
the audio is working.
The audio is working.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll keep talking as though.
Here we go. We're back.
Come back now. Okay, I'll keep talking now as though we haven't got any streaming issues. Otherwise, you can hear us talking. Well, we've got the spinning wheel of death again. Alrighty. So this is what I'm saying. What would be cool to see? Well, how about taking all the code that's in all the expression shapes? You know what? I'm going to stop sharing my video just in case that's what it is. I don't know if that's what it is, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But imagine taking all your expression shapes and all the code in there and compiling it into a DLL and then uploading that DLL into a function. But if you took just the code from the orchestration, you in theory could do it, depending on what you're doing with your code. If your code is referencing a third-party assembly, then you need that assembly, in the function app as well.
Yeah,
So
in an ideal world, those assemblies would be packaged into the BizTalk app, and
yeah, exactly.
and you'd be able to just take those as references.
Yeah, exactly. So in theory, that could be done. At a minimum, the source code could be generated for a function app that would have, and it would be up to you to do it. But that would be kind of cool. And then all that would have to happen is for an expression shape in the logic app, it would make a call out to a function, passing in, this is the entry point I want. Support for more shapes, terminate and suspend should be relatively trivial to do. Looping, in theory, should be relatively trivial to do. Listen is a more interesting one, but again, is possible because that would be the equivalent of adding in a service bus action, which is looking for messages on a subscription. Correlation sets is harder, but again possible because they're the equivalent of sessions in service bus. So in theory, you could do that. But what else? What else would be cool to see? I should have put a link to the survey, which is where you could answer and.
Yeah, I sent the survey out in the chat. I sent the link to the survey out in the chat, Dan.
Oh, did you?
So yeah, so it's.
Cool.
So I'll send it again just in case the chat's scrolled down. But aka.ms/BizTalk migration survey.
Awesome. And that's also on the GitHub repo. If you go to the AIM tool GitHub repo, there's a big yellow or blue link you can click to the survey. Alrighty. So takeaway from this was just that the tool gives you a good framework for migrating your orchestrations, but you will need to modify them to make them work. But it at least brings up, it's giving you a lot of stuff there so that you can start to work with it. And in some cases, it won't make sense to have a converted orchestration depending on what it's doing. But it's a really good starting point. But I'd be interested to find out if it did more, if it could bring your code up and do a lot more. That would make things easier. You wouldn't need even if the orchestration.
Yeah, and as with all applications, I mean, it's Pareto principle always applies. There's always sort of 80. That's okay. Just concentrate on the small number that you've really got to refine.
Very much so. Alrighty, and that's me. Thank you.
That's it. Back to you, Valerie.
Well, excellent. Thank you so very much, and we'll take a look and see how this all turned out on the recording, and get it up on available for people to watch later too. So thank you so much, everybody, and we'll be back next month with another iteration of BizTalk Live.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye now.
Bye.
Yes, thank you. Bye.